Picture a woman standing at the edge of a cliff in what is now southern France. She is maybe 30 years old, which means she is already considered old by the standards of her time. Behind her, 3 children sleep under a shelter made from hides belonging to animals no one in her group has seen in 2 full seasons. She has not eaten a real meal in 4 days. The children do not know that. She has made sure of it. She is not scanning the horizon the way her people used to, reading cloud movement, calculating distance, tracking herds with a precision that took decades to develop. She is looking at it the way you look at something that has stopped making sense. The river she crossed every autumn since childhood has changed course. The hill where her group tracked bison last season is now a shallow lake. The forest her grandmother warned her never to enter has doubled in size and swallowed every landmark she navigated by. The world her mother taught her to read like a face she loved is dissolving in real time. She does not have a word for climate change. She only knows the system she trusted with her life is failing, and she has 3 hungry children, and it is almost winter. What she does next is the reason you exist. And the question this story is built around is one that has haunted scientists for more than a century. What separated the humans who survived from the ones who did not? Because most did not. When the Ice Age ended, it triggered one of the most severe population collapses in the entire history of our species. Entire ways of life, refined across tens of thousands of years, were erased without successors. The filtering was fast, brutal, and left almost no margin for error. What made the difference is not what most people expect. And it begins not in the warming, but in what the warming destroyed. To understand what was lost, you first have to understand what had been built. For more than 40,000 years, longer than all of recorded human civilization, multiplied by 4 humans, had engineered an extraordinarily effective survival system inside one of the harshest environments Earth has ever produced. The Ice Age world was brutal, but it had one quality that made it survivable. It was consistent. Season after season, century after century, the world behaved according to patterns that could be learned, memorized, and passed down. And humans had done exactly that, with a precision that modern observers consistently underestimate. Massive grassland ecosystems called the Mammoth Steppe stretched across Eurasia and North America, forming some of the most productive cold weather habitats in planetary history. Woolly mammoths, steppe bison, cave lions, giant reindeer animals that moved along migration corridors so stable and seasonally reliable that human groups could predict their movements years in advance. Sea levels were more than 120 meters lower than today, exposing vast land bridges connecting continents, now separated by open ocean. Ice Age humans had built a high-efficiency survival machine, massive prey with extraordinary caloric returns, open terrain with long visibility, and a knowledge base refined across hundreds of generations. A single mammoth hunt could sustain a family of 30 for weeks. This was not primitive life. It was a finely calibrated system, optimized over millennia for exactly the conditions it operated in. And that was the problem. Because when the conditions change, everything you optimized becomes a liability. The warming did not arrive gently. In some regions of the northern hemisphere, temperatures rose by as much as 5 to 10 degrees Celsius within decades, not centuries, not millennia, but within a single human lifespan. Modern climate discussions measure change in tenths of a degree per decade. This was multiple degrees per decade, sustained across continental scales, with no warning and no precedent in any living memory. The last humans who had faced anything like this had died thousands of years earlier. The knowledge of what it demanded had not survived with them. Entire ecosystems reorganized within one lifetime. Open grasslands that had sustained megafauna for tens of thousands of years fragmented and disappeared. Forests pushed northward. Wetlands spread across what had been solid hunting ground. Permafrost thawed across vast regions, turning reliable terrain into unstable, waterlogged earth that swallowed trails and buried landmarks. Rivers shifted course. Coastlines moved inward. drowning the land bridges that had connected human populations across hemispheres. The world did not simply get warmer, it became illegible. Every piece of environmental knowledge humans had accumulated, every seasonal pattern, every river crossing, every prey behavior had been learned inside a context that was now dissolving faster than learning could keep pace. The world had not changed its rules gradually, giving time to adapt. It had discarded them entirely, replacing a system humans had mastered over 40,000 years with something no living person had ever seen. And here is what the survival question forces you to confront. This was not a single crisis with a clear beginning and a survivable end. It was a sustained collapse across multiple interconnected systems, hitting simultaneously, compounding one failure on top of another, with no peak, no obvious path through, and no precedent to guide anyone who was trying to navigate it. Most people, facing it, had no answer that worked, and the ones who eventually found one did not find it quickly or without enormous cost. The first system to collapse was energy. Every Ice Age hunting strategy had been built around megafauna, large animals delivering enormous caloric returns for coordinated group effort. A single woolly mammoth represented approximately 3 million kilocalories of food energy, enough to feed a group of 30 people for 3 full months. One hunt, one animal, months of security. The system had been refined over tens of thousands of years to extract this energy with remarkable efficiency, coordinated drives, cliff ambushes, strategic terrain use. Group communication developed across generations of shared practice. As temperatures rose and habitats fragmented, these animals declined with a speed that was almost incomprehensible to the people experiencing it. Large-bodied megafauna, reproduced slowly, required vast ranges of specific habitat, and could not adapt fast enough to ecosystems reorganizing around them. Hunting pressure from groups compressed into shrinking ranges accelerated the collapse further, creating a feedback loop of desperation and depletion that ended in local extinction. Within a few human generations, within the living memory of people still alive, the animals that had sustained civilization for 40,000 years were gone. Parents who had fed their children on mammoth meat watched their grandchildren starve in a landscape those animals no longer crossed. The calories that had built human life across an entire geological epoch disappeared within the span of a single family's memory, and the substitutes were brutally inadequate. Smaller animals offered a fraction of the caloric return for far greater effort. Plant foods demanded tools, knowledge, and seasonal expertise that no living person had systematically developed. The energy math simply did not work, and without energy, every other survival system failed faster. The second system to fail was mobility. Ice Age humans were extraordinary long-distance travelers. Open terrain with long sightlines and stable seasonal patterns allowed groups to move fluidly across vast landscapes, tracking herds across hundreds of kilometers, maintaining contact with other groups across continental scales, repositioning seasonally to access the best resources available. This was not wandering. It was precision logistics, executed across geographic scales that most modern people find difficult to imagine, navigated without maps or instruments, using environmental knowledge so deeply internalized it had become instinct. As forests thickened and wetlands expanded, that freedom of movement began to close. Visibility dropped from horizon scale to tree-line scale. Travel that had taken days across open steppe now took weeks through forest and bog. Landmarks disappeared under vegetation. Ancient migration routes, corridors memorized, named, embedded in story, passed down across dozens of generations, vanished under new growth or sank beneath rising water. Groups that had ranged freely across enormous territories were suddenly compressed into shrinking ecological pockets, cut off from the resource zones they depended on, and unable to reach the other groups whose knowledge and materials had been part of their extended survival system. Compression, in a collapsing system, is a death sentence written in slow motion. A compressed group cannot track mobile food sources across a landscape it can no longer read. It cannot receive information from other groups about conditions elsewhere. It cannot spread its own knowledge outward before the knowledge, and the people who carry it disappear entirely. Mobility had been the circulatory system of Ice Age survival, the mechanism by which food, information, people, and ideas moved through the network of human groups across a continent. When it failed, everything it had been quietly sustaining began to fail alongside it. The deepest failure was invisible. It had no physical form. You could not point to it in the landscape or weigh it in your hands. And yet, it determined survival outcomes more decisively than cold, or hunger, or territorial compression. It was the failure of knowledge itself. For tens of thousands of years, human survival had depended on accumulated environmental intelligence, an invisible library built across countless generations of observation, trial, error, and the slow discipline of translating experience into transmissible understanding. Where the reindeer crossed the river in early autumn, which berry was safe after the first frost, and which one would kill a child. How the behavior of a specific bird changed 3 days before a major storm. None of this was written. It lived in memory, in story, in the practiced hands of elders teaching children, in rituals that embedded survival knowledge in cultural form so it could outlast the deaths of individuals. And then the environment this knowledge described stopped existing, not slowly, not in a way that allowed incremental updating, but within decades, the world encoded in that accumulated library became unrecognizable. A hunting ground from a grandmother's stories might now be a lake. A seasonal migration pattern memorized since childhood might shift by 3 months and never return. A river ford used across 4 generations might now lie under 15 meters of water. The accumulated knowledge of dozens of generations became, within a few lifetimes, not just outdated but actively dangerous. It pointed toward food that was no longer there. It predicted weather that no longer behaved that way. It mapped a world that had ceased to exist. And a group navigating by a broken map does not just get lost. It makes confident, well-reasoned decisions that lead directly to starvation and death. The archaeological record does not leave room for comfortable interpretation about what happened next. Across Eurasia and North America, the evidence tells the same story in the same language of absence and silence. Entire site clusters occupied continuously for thousands of years go completely dark within a few centuries. Tool traditions refined across 20 or 30 generations, elegant, sophisticated, studied by archaeologists today, with genuine admiration simply vanish. Not replaced, not transformed, vanished, with no successor and no cultural continuity visible in the layers above. The large, coordinated hunting societies that had dominated the Ice Age landscape shatter into smaller, isolated fragments, scattered across territories that can no longer support them. Population estimates for this period are necessarily approximate, but the convergence of multiple lines of evidence tells a consistent and disturbing story. Genetic analysis of ancient and modern human populations reveals that human numbers crashed catastrophically in many regions during this transition. In parts of Eurasia, the genetic diversity of surviving populations collapsed to levels consistent with extreme bottlenecking, the kind of reduction that, in any other species, we would classify without hesitation as a near-extinction event. The survivors were not a representative cross-section of their ancestral populations. They were the remnants of a filter so severe it left permanent signatures in the DNA of every human being alive today. We carry, in our genomes, the statistical shadow of the people who did not make it. The question survival forces you to answer is this: what did those people have that everyone else did not? Here is what the textbooks get wrong about agriculture. They frame it as a discovery, an invention that arrived when humans were finally smart enough, settled enough, ambitious enough to cultivate the land. They place it at the beginning of progress, as though it were a choice made from a position of possibility. It was not. Agriculture was not invented by people who were thriving. It was invented by people who were out of options. It was not a step forward. It was a last resort, and understanding that changes everything about what it means. The groups that arrived at agriculture did not arrive there through curiosity or ingenuity applied to a comfortable life. They arrived there through a sequence of failures, so total energy collapse, mobility collapse, knowledge collapse, that every strategy they had ever relied on had already been exhausted. They had tried hunting smaller animals, not enough calories. They had tried moving to better territory. There was none left that they could reach. They had tried living on what the warming landscape offered spontaneously. It was not enough, and it was not reliable. And then, somewhere at the edge of starvation, in a landscape that had taken everything from them, some of them started doing something that no human being before them had ever done. They began trying to control the food supply instead of just following it, staying in one place long enough to watch a plant grow, selecting seeds from the plants that produced the most, clearing ground, managing water, protecting certain species at the expense of others. Not because it was elegant, not because they understood what they were building, but because they were watching their children starve, and this was the only move they had left. What we call the agricultural revolution was, at its origin, an emergency response. The fact that it eventually produced cities and writing and civilization is almost an accident of desperation, a last resort that happened, against all odds, to work. The survival transformation was not only technological, it reshaped the fundamental social structure of human groups in ways that would echo through the rest of human history. The large, kinship-based hunting bands of the Ice Age had been held together by the logic of megafauna hunting. You needed many people to coordinate a drive, process a large kill, defend a territory large enough to support a viable range. When the megafauna disappeared, those large groups became liabilities. They consumed more than fragmented environments could provide. They could not move fast enough. And they collapsed not from a single crisis, but from the accumulated weight of a world that had stopped rewarding their design. Smaller bands became the dominant social unit, more mobile, more flexible, capable of surviving on resource bases that would not have sustained the larger groups of the previous era. But smaller groups carried a dangerous new vulnerability. They could not hold enough knowledge on their own, so they built networks. Archaeological evidence from this period shows a dramatic expansion of long-distance connection between groups, obsidian from volcanic sources, hundreds of kilometers away appearing at coastal sites, shell ornaments from specific coastlines turning up deep inland, shared symbolic systems appearing across vast geographic distances in ways that cannot be explained by anything other than sustained, intentional communication. These were not casual trade routes. They were information infrastructure, deliberately maintained relationships that allowed knowledge, materials, and emergency support to flow across distances no single group could cover alone. The groups that survived were not the strongest or the most skilled. They were the ones most deeply embedded in networks that no single disaster could completely sever. By 11,700 years ago, when the climate finally stabilized into what we now call the Holocene, the Ice Age was gone in every sense that mattered. The megafauna were largely extinct. The landscapes had transformed beyond recognition, and the human population of the planet had been reduced, in many regions, to a fraction of what it had been at the peak of the Ice Age. The filtering had been thorough and merciless, and yet something had come through, something small, networked, desperate, and already being shaped by the specific pressure of its survival into the foundation of every civilization that would follow. The woman on the cliff in southern France, if her group survived, would not have lived to see the stabilization. The transition outlasted any single lifetime. But something she built, some alliance forged across an unfamiliar river, some knowledge preserved in a story told to a child on a night when she did not know if there would be food in the morning, may have been the thread that carried her line through. We cannot know her name, but her genetic signature is likely still present in modern populations, in the faint statistical trace of a lineage that passed through an extreme bottleneck and came out the other side intact. The dominance of Homo sapiens was not decided in the cold. It was decided in the collapse that followed. It was decided by which groups could dismantle 40,000 years of optimization and build something new under conditions designed to make building impossible. From that quality forged under that specific pressure came agriculture, cities, writing, science, and the civilization you were born into. That is what separated the survivors from the ones who disappeared into silence. And it is still the most important thing our species has ever learned about itself. Subscribe to Prehistoric Shadows, where the hidden survival technologies that built the human species are still waiting to be understood.